Good evening. On behalf of the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology Department at the University of Northern Iowa, I would like to welcome you to our Diversity Colloquium. Tonight's event is in partnership with the Office of the Provost and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. The Colloquium Committee and I would like to express our thanks to Provost Wolpart and Dean Bass for their support. The Diversity Colloquium is a series meant to highlight the work of UNI faculty, students, and local community members and organizations to build a more inclusive and diverse society. Tonight's event is a panel discussion on race, social justice, and policing. My name is Ashley Kaiser-Moon, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology and will be serving as the moderator for tonight's discussion. I'm joined by three esteemed panelists whom I will briefly introduce. First, congressional staff member for Congresswoman Abby Finkenauer and social justice activist, Mr. Ryan Stevenson. Ryan Stevenson graduated from UNI in 2018, where he studied political communication. During his time at UNI, he served as a member of the Student Senate and the president of the Black Male Leaders Union. After a period of incarceration that began his senior year, Stevenson got back into politics, citing a determination not to be placed in a box. As he was finishing his degree at UNI, Ryan began work as a political canvasser and organizer for Congresswoman Finkenauer's first congressional campaign covering Blackhawk County, playing a role in record voter turnout in the area. He was also a part of the team that formed the legislation, A More Perfect Union, to address policing on the state level. He is an outspoken voice locally to get the city of Waterloo to be proactive in addressing issues that not only pertain to policing, but housing as well. Earlier this year, Ryan received the 2020 MLK Junior Banquet Award for community engagement and empowerment through the civic process and was named one of the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier 2020 20 Under 40 award winners. And we want to thank Ryan for his participation this evening. Our second panelist this evening is Waterloo Chief of Police, Dr. Joel Fitzgerald. Chief Fitzgerald is a 28-year law enforcement veteran. He was born in Southwest Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1971 and was educated at the historic Overbrook High School. He attended Villanova University, where he graduated with a BA degree in liberal arts. He then continued his education at Eastern University, where he earned his Master's of Business Administration degree and then later his PhD in Business Administration at North Central University. Chief Fitzgerald gained appointment to the City of Philadelphia Police Department in 1992 and served in various ranks before his 2009 selection to serve as the first African-American Chief of Police in Missouri City, Texas. In 2013, he returned to Pennsylvania and became the first African-American Chief of Police in the history of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Fitzgerald served as the first African-American Chief of Police of the City of Fort Worth Police Department, leading one of the largest departments in the country. Under his command, the Fort Worth Police Department became the largest state accredited, recognized in Texas, in training officers in de-escalation, procedural justice, and implicit bias. And in 2020, Chief Fitzgerald became the first African-American police chief of Waterloo, Iowa. We also thank Chief Fitzgerald for his willingness to participate in tonight's conversation.
That was a mouthful.
All right, our third panelist this evening is our own Professor of Criminology, Dr. Gayle Rhineberger. Dr. Rhineberger joined the UNI Criminology faculty in 2005. She teaches classes on crime and inequality, criminal justice ethics, communication ethics for criminal justice professionals, media and the crime, and criminology senior seminar, where students are exposed to the negative consequences of working in the criminal justice system, such as job stress, secondary trauma, and burnout. Every one of Dr. Rhineberger's classes incorporates themes of inequality, racism, discrimination, implicit bias, and ethics. She challenges her students to be self-reflective of their minds and bodies, to think about the person they are right now and the person they want to be, and the criminal justice professional they want to be in the future. Dr. Rhineberger has an exemplary publication record with 25 peer-reviewed publications, 14 technical reports, over 55 conference presentations, and 9 invited talks. She was recently interviewed for a piece on Inside UNI on the future of policing, and Dr. Rhineberger currently serves as a member of the Waterloo Police Chief's Citizen Advisory Committee. So also the Colloquium Committee expresses their thanks to Dr. Rhineberger for participating. So to get started this evening, The Diversity Colloquium series was created in 2016 in response to police brutality incidents nationwide, specifically the uprisings and protests that took place in Ferguson, Missouri after the murder of Michael Brown. 5 years later, we continue to see mass protests and uprisings across the nation, most recently in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, leaving many people feeling like not much has changed. In your experience, work, and/or activism, what has changed about the state of race, social justice, and policing since 2015? So Ryan, would you like to take the first?
What has changed, right? What has changed is that with the advancements of technology and uses of camera phones, right, what has long been the Black experience, right, is becoming a part of everyone's. It's visualized for everyone daily, right? I think, when we passed the More Perfect Union this summer, Iowa was one of 3 states to actually pass police reform legislation at the time. I'm not sure if other states have since then, but I know that we were only one of 3 at the time. I think that what has changed is that I honestly, to me, nothing. Right, but because you can look at police departments like Minneapolis, right? There are a lot of things were within their policies already, right? You would look at them as a department that probably had done a lot of the right things, right? But when you get, regardless of policy, right? If the culture is still there, right? If there's still really no penalties for misconduct and brutality, then it continues to breed a culture of hey, I can get away with it. And you would see in different parts of the country, right, in some of the states and cities that will be considered the most progressive in the country, right, where brutality is still an issue because of the stronghold that police unions have across the country, right? So while you might see more people saying Black Lives Matter or this is something that we care about, right? At the end of the day, right, we still not seeing these officers being held to the standard that regular citizens would be if they were to carry out some of the acts that they are doing, right? We have an issue with without a doubt, right? Police are supposed to protect and serve, right? And in some instances, when when deadly force is warranted, right, to save the lives of other people, right, when other people's lives and safety is at risk, right? But when we got instances where people are running away from the police and still being shot, and people are, like George Floyd being pinned to the ground and choked, right? But we still have this cloak of qualified immunity, right? So we still, the culture is still that, hey, if and when we do something, right, to violate somebody's space, someone's body, and possibly end someone's life, right, there's still safeguards in place that allow us to keep our jobs, and in many instances or never receive any type of penalty for our actions.
Chief Fitzgerald, would you like to respond?
It's more of an agreement than a response. There's been tremendous upheaval in the law enforcement community, and I will harken back to Trayvon Martin as being a seminal moment for me in policing. Although I was around when the Rodney King beating happened, I will tell you that I more closely identified with the Trayvon Martin situation because I was such a young police officer around that time that I didn't have the awareness that I do now of the gravity of what that meant in our world. The last few years has been a battle of the fittest for police leaders across the country. You've seen so many leaders shy away, retire, and not have the courage to confront some of the things that Ryan spoke about. We have problems within our industry, and it truly takes a great amount of courage to come into an organization, any organization, and promote the kind of cultural shift, the paradigm shift that you need to create the culture of accountability. And leaders aren't willing to do that today. And you're seeing a newer generation of leaders, especially since 2015, that are willing to step up, willing to assist with reform, willing to create policy and back that policy with action. And, you know, since I'm an insider, I do understand and do identify with a lot of what Mr. Stevenson said. Again, if you put policy in place and you don't shape the policy into the culture of the organization, and there's not that backdrop of, hey, well, this is what we stand for. This is our mission, our vision, and our values, and this is how it applies in terms of policy. And if we vacillate from that, there's a certainty of punishment. And then there's an assumption of culpability on the part of the police department. We get into situations where the community believes that the police do whatever they like to do and there's no repercussion. And it's put us in a situation where we have to defend this whole industry. And it's really not right. It's not right because I think that there are leaders out there now that want to do the right thing and want to change the face of policing. And with that, it's not necessarily, it shouldn't necessarily at least be seen as an attack on policing. It should be seen as a movement towards shaping policing more in the visage of what the community sees their police department being. And the police are the community are the police, right? And we sometimes don't understand that. And we need to be reminded that, listen, although we put on a badge and a gun every day and represent a city, and we're a big group of people that love on each other and believe in each other and back each other up, willing to sacrifice our lives for citizens, we still work for the citizens in the community. We still work for every resident. We still have to do things that, you know, maybe leave a bad taste in our mouth. And you know what? That's our job. And when we get away from the core value of what our jobs entail, and we're not willing to hold people, you know, to a certain standard, we get into trouble with members of the community, especially those in racially polarized areas who have seen systematic effects, sociological effects, if you will, and upon a certain demographic of people that has led to a cyclical, you know, sort of impoverishment and lack of education. I can go on forever about it, but I'm going to let my colleague Gayle Rhineberger chime in here.
So Gayle, from your perspective, then what do you see as having changed or perhaps even not changed since 2015?
In some ways, nothing has changed, as Ryan has said, and in other ways, there are clearly some things that have changed or appear to have changed. We are having more intentional conversations than we did 5 years ago, I think, in policing and in the community and in education. And I think that that's part of the stepping stone process of getting us to a better place than where we have been. But in the end, policies exist. We know policies exist. And policies don't mean anything if they're not adhered to from the heart. You can have a policy, but if you don't really believe in that policy or that everyone follows it, then it doesn't actually do any good. And the trick is, or the key is, to make people aware of how you're adhering to that policy, what it actually means to the community, rather than just paying lip service. And I'm not saying that's what I think is happening in Waterloo. I don't think that at all. But I think nationwide, there's a whole lot of lip service about how much police departments are doing to try to change. And in reality, not much has changed. You can have implicit bias training, you can have sexual harassment training, and we know statistically that those trainings don't work to actually improve those situations. It does not change people's hearts. In fact, it can do more harm than good, but we still have to do something. There's that pressure, that feeling that we have to do something, even though we know they don't work. The key really is, you can't jump in and say, let's change the police. It doesn't just start there. it's actually a change that goes much deeper in our culture of how we raise people, how we talk about race. And so many people, white people, do not talk about race. And that is a huge disservice to our friends in the community. Because by not talking about race, we're saying it doesn't matter. We actually have to intentionally talk about it. So from my perspective as an educator, in the last 5 years, I talk a whole lot more very explicitly about implicit bias. I talk a lot more about what it means to be an ally, and a lot about self-reflection. My students may not like a lot about that self-reflection piece because they have to be honest. I tell them you need to be honest and look in the mirror and talk about the things that you've done, at least to yourself. You don't have to talk about with them to me or anybody else, but you need to look in the mirror and be honest, because until our white population looks in the mirror and starts being honest about what they have done, even if they don't want to be, nobody wants to be, well, I take it back. Most people don't want to be racist, and don't realize that they are. But if we don't talk about it, there's no room, there's no growth. So from my perspective, I talk a lot more to my students about what these things actually mean, about the necessity of looking in the mirror and challenging yourself daily. And it's okay to say, yeah, I did something bad, but I'm going to fix it. I can do better. Constantly self-improvement of doing better. So those are the kinds of things that I focus on in my classes to get students to think a little bit deeper about who they can be in a job as a police officer or a probation officer, and about being a good person, a humane person. So definitely the events of the past 5 years have made me more aware of our need to do more explicit discussion of that. Because once they leave our institution, they go to the academy, and sometimes we see that we've totally lost them once they enter a police department and come back and talk to our class. It's like a different person has come back to talk to my students.
Can I chime in? I don't know if Ryan wanted to say something else. Did you, Ryan?
Go ahead. I'll follow up. Go ahead.
All right. I disagree that implicit bias and procedural justice training doesn't work. And I will use some of what our esteemed colleague over here, Ms. Dunn, said to counter that a bit by saying, in the classroom environment, when you are exposing people, to implicit bias type of discomfort, that needs to happen in a police department, because we have already at this point hired people. You have people that are in a position because they want to be there, because they have paid now to learn and paid to be a part of your environment. Our folks are people from all types of environments and all walks of life that come here because they want to work in this environment. And we don't have the privilege of having the students that have fresh minds and being able to shape those fresh minds very early on in their lives all the time. Yes, we get young police officers that graduate the police academy, but we also have a large percentage of officers that are here that have had a certain way of doing business for however many years. And I would argue that, a lot of those officers do need to reevaluate and reassess, as you put it in different words, how they are managing their emotions and managing what they're seeing from citizens. And part of that management entails us making them confront their own implicit biases and understanding that although I may not walk like them, talk like them, and other people in the Black, brown, and tan community may not, look like the majority of officers that we have in our department or that most departments have around the country, that we have to understand that because the communication means is different, it doesn't mean that we're making furtive movements. It doesn't mean that we're, a threat. And that's where, if we're reaching a third of the people in a class, statistically, it may not look like it's working. But if you're just changing the opinions of a third of the people and moving folks towards an understanding that people that don't look like us aren't necessarily threatening, that I think it's worthwhile. It's an investment, but it's an investment that maybe in the 5-year term didn't turn around a positive result. But perhaps in 10 years, like a maturing bond, we may see a difference in the way people walk, talk, and act.
Well, I think, like, I'm not completely against the trainings, right? But I do know that, right, there's only so much that you can grasp in, what is it, say if the class is just a weekend, right? I have an older family member that was, we had a conversation about integrating schools, right, and busing. While a lot of people were in support of that, you know, they felt like busing really didn't do anything to fix the problem, right? Because we were just sending kids over to school for that school day. And then at the end of the school, they were going right back to their communities, right? So while a training, those trainings are a step, until you submerge yourself in another culture, and while there's no way that you will really understand that other culture, right? Like, we all have friends in different races, and one thing that I've in this moment when I'm talking to, especially my white peers and my white friends, I challenge them with, when is the last time you went and met with your black or your Hispanic friend on their terms, right? When was the last time you didn't go to a bar or restaurant that you were comfortable with going to, rather than, you know, having them come somewhere where you felt like it was your natural habitat, where you listened to the music that you wanted to listen to, ate the food that you wanted to eat, and was surrounded by people that you may not have known, but you know that they had a similar upbringing in you, right? That is the only way that regardless, I mean, like I said, those trainings are important, right? But as long as we don't have those natural interactions with various cultures, right, it's really not doing any of us any good, not just black people or brown people, but white people as well, right? I think, like, the policing is at the tip of everyone's tongue right now, but like you said, Dr. Rhineberger, it's way bigger than that, right? But I think when we're talking about these oppressive systems that we are up against as people of color, right, it starts with policing, because it typically starts with this criminal justice system that puts people of color at a disadvantage as other individuals, right? So while it's the trend or the fad, right, to talk about policing, we cannot talk about policing without talking about the whole system, you know, failing us all. And I know talking to Chief Fitzgerald is tough, because he really knows his stuff as a police officer, right? And I really respect him as the chief, as just someone that knows his field. But I also understand that when he takes that uniform off, he's seen as just a black man, just like me and everyone else, right? So I know that when we're talking about addressing these systems, right, when they see him in his uniform, he could probably be the exception. He's the good guy. He's one of the good ones, right? But when you take off that uniform, how is he treated, you know? And like I said, policing is the beginning of it all. But the only way that we can talk about race relations in this country and social justice, not even for black people, but for brown people, for LGBTQ people, for anyone that is mistreated and deprived of their constitutional rights, right? We have to talk about the oppressive system within the United States of America.
So, Dr. Rhineberger, one of the things that you had said in response to that question about what has changed is that, you know, some things have, some things haven't. So throughout the United States right now, there are calls for both police reform and to defund the police. So I'd like to ask you to start, what are the differences in these two approaches? So what is police reform, and what does defunding the police really mean, and how might the implementation affect society?
Well, first, there is no uniform definition of defunding. If you look at it, and that's not a new concept. Neither reform nor defunding are new concepts. They've just kind of come to the forefront in the last couple of months. I'm a strong supporter of police reform. I care about my students going into policing. I care about my students of color who are not going into policing, and who are, because of the color of their skin, at more risk of being brought into the criminal justice system. So I'm deeply concerned that we do have reform in policing. And reform in itself just is about making changes to police activities. It could be in terms of training within departments, it could be in academy training. The police departments across the country have a very often unified way of training that is very much about protecting police, which of course it is a job. We want police officers to go home safely to their families. But on the other hand, we also need for police to police humanely. And reform is part of the way to get there. Making changes to how we train police, making changes to what we expect of police officers, making changes in how we talk about policing. So oftentimes people only do think about policing in terms of arrests and traffic stops. We forget that police departments, police officers are often the first on scene to car accidents, to fatalities not having anything to do with crime, a car crash with, decapitated children, people impaled on fence posts. That you don't come away unscathed from those kinds of things. They matter. And we often don't talk about that enough, about how that impacts police officers. And contrary to, I think I would call it a myth that most police officers like to draw their guns and want to do those kinds of things. Most police officers do not want to do that. Their goal is not to set out to harm individuals, but that implicit bias creeps in. And implicit bias is a key part of police reform. Defunding is different. So currently, no unified definition of what defunding means, but sort of a common thread out there is that defund doesn't mean that we don't have police departments. Defund doesn't mean that you give a police department $0. Defund really means that you're reallocating the money that has currently been given to police departments that really deals with quality of life stuff that needs to go back to quality of life kinds of things like mental health, drug treatment programs, domestic violence programs, homelessness. Take your pick. Police do not have the academic training or the professional training of any kind to be all of those things. They can't be social workers, drug treatment counselors, mental health professionals, and police officers. That is impossible. I mean, some do it. Some individuals do it. We do not want to make the mistake of lumping all police officers together, just like we don't want to make the mistake of lumping all Black men or Hispanic men or Black and brown and tan individuals all together, or we don't want to do that. With defunding police, the key is really to take that money away from policing, some of it, doesn't mean all of it. Again, we're talking about some cities that have $15 billion budgets. Some of that money going back into communities that are quality of life issues, reallocating that to those kinds of services, particularly in minority communities where those services have often left. Those services are not funded anymore. They're not in areas where people who need them can reach them. So those quality of life services are not getting what they need. If we had money going into those quality of life services, police could focus more on doing what police should be doing, could be doing, what they do, instead of intermingling it with everything else. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but if those services are available, then police don't have to be mental health counselors, drug treatment counselors, and social workers.
So it's interesting, right? Chief Fitzgerald started at I would have, if I was him, I would have probably delayed my start date, like coming in at this time, right? But I think in Waterloo, necessarily as far as with the police department, I didn't have to, I shouldn't say because this was way bigger than me, right? But we didn't have to push for reform within the department because I remember it was a meeting set up with me and him and he was already intending to change a lot of things within the way he runs his policy. So I appreciate and I applaud him for that. So our police department, we really didn't have to look for reform. But I think that if we would have had our old chief on still, it would have been an issue, right? Just recently, he was on a forum and said that he believed that his use of force policy should have only been a couple of pages because he wanted to keep things simple. And that's problematic, right? And you see with a lot of things that was, going on in Waterloo, we gave out a lot of money and police brutality and misconduct, right? So I think that we were blessed in that instance, but I also believe that the city of Waterloo should be moving forward on things being a lot more proactive and codifying and making sure that there were other things in place that allow to the process of complaints and disciplinary action to be more transparent. I think we talk about reform. You see some of the things that we passed on the state level, right? Which you would think would be, would be simple, right? With no-brainer things, and thankfully we passed them with unanimous votes through the House and the Senate, right? But why do we have to address chokeholds, right? Is that anything anyone should be doing? The fact that officers quit or resign or get fired from different departments and then move 10 miles down the road and apply for a position at another department, right? And also taking cases, from local county attorneys, right? Cases of misconduct and brutality, and the attorney general evaluate that, right? Those type of things should be no-brainers, right? So I guess those are reform. But when we the defund the police thing is very interesting to me, because it is all things always tend to be problematic based on who they come from, right? And as we can see, I'm sure most of y'all live in Cedar Falls, right? But they defunded the police in Cedar Falls. Like PSOs, we talk about reallocating funds. Police officers shouldn't be firefighters, right? And firefighters shouldn't be, they should be worried about fighting fires, and police officers should be worried about, keeping communities safe, right? So we talk about reallocating funds, like Dr. Rhineberger said, like it's about reallocating funds to be most beneficial for the people. What are we doing to protect and serve the community as a whole, right? You hear a lot of times officers are like, why am I having to respond to this, right? This is not something that I'm trained for. It's something that I shouldn't have to, right? I know people that have issues with their children that are calling the police, and it's like, it can be a lot of things, right? But is an officer supposed to be a family mediator? No, I don't think so, right? But I think that, is the term defund the police the most pleasant to one's ears? No. I can't lie. When I first heard it, I'm like, hold up, what? Because the very first officer I ever met was my grandmother, right? And she told me that there's a difference in police officers and then there's cops, right? So I think when we talking about defund the police, it's not to get rid of police officers, right? Because no one wants to live in an anarchist society, but we do need to do something about these cops, right? That abuse their power and, for whatever reason, right? Whether they shouldn't be in that position as a whole, or they handling situations that they shouldn't be involved in.
So I can totally agree that reallocation of sorts has to happen. I'm going to buttress that with the state made the decision, every state, in the 70s and the 80s, to push these services that are now police-related deliveries to the police departments when they started closing hospitals that dealt with the mentally ill. They didn't provide the adequate level of services for people returning from war. All of these defundings that they've done at the state level, have now trickled down to what the police officer has to deal with on the street every day. So Dr. Rhineberger is absolutely correct that we're not as equipped as we should be to handle those types of things. Maybe I shouldn't say as we should be. We're not as equipped, period, to deal with those things. And policing has become being the Swiss Army knife of social services. I've coined that phrase. It is truly beyond the grasp of most young police officers to go into situations, as Ryan just cited, and to be the person that decides how to discipline a child, or the person that mediates a custody dispute when we can't do anything in a custody dispute most times anyway. The person that comes to to a scene of someone that's mentally ill inside of their own home that threatens to take their life, and they're the only person inside that house. Do we kick their door in and then go in and create a situation where that person is killed because we put ourselves in a situation where, the person wants to, suicide by cop? I don't want any of my police officers put into those situations where they're ill-equipped to deal with those things. And that's where, good policy, good leadership comes in, and making those decisions about what is defunding versus a reallocation. A reallocation needs to happen, and that reallocation has to be the result of intensive analysis as to what the percentages of calls that we're dealing with that actually are beyond us. No one has done that. No one has said, okay, we've said 75% of the people that are in jail right now have mental illness, but what are we doing to address the mental illness problems out in society? You can't even drop a person off at half of the, police officers. By what I mean by this is a police officer will respond to a scene of a mentally ill person, someone in crisis, and many times not have a one or two places that are supposed to take those people, say that their beds are 100% full, and be turned away. Then what do? Do you criminalize the person for having a crisis? And many times that's what happens. Their crisis evolves into such a scene where a police officer has to take some kind of action outside of taking someone to a hospital that, it becomes your next viral video where the police officer is struggling with somebody that is just in crisis. I don't want officers to even respond to those events. I do think we need civilians to be able to respond to those events. But for now, what we have is what we are working with. And those are the police officers who we can send to a 40-hour school, and that 40-hour school be crisis intervention training. What we've done in Waterloo is every police officer, every sworn member of the Waterloo Police Department has had basic CIT training, which is, as Ryan spoke about earlier, only like an 8-hour training course. And we've selected people to take a now 40-hour training course, which by far doesn't make them any type of expert in that area, but it gives us a better opportunity, at least improves our chances of being able to call the person to the scene that has the temperament and the training to be able to back it up a little, slow it down, and to have a conversation with someone or to connect them with the services that they need. So yes, those resources have to be pushed over to equipping not only a police officer, but maybe a civilian with that police officer to go out and proactively engage people, right? Follow up on the people that are making 15, 20, 50 phone calls a week to the police department, having you come to, adjust the behavior of their children or in crisis. We've got to this is what we actually have to do now. We have to go out and proactively engage folks that haven't taken medication and say, why haven't you taken your medication this week? We need to make sure you do it. We need to hook you up with your doctor, your counselor, your social worker to stop the influx of other work-related calls that we're getting that conflate our numbers as far as, what we're doing and how much we have to respond in any particular community. And as luck might have it, it's the Black and the brown and the tan community where we're going, over and over again, and in the minds of police officers and the perceptions of a lot of Americans, that's the community where everything happens. When in fact, that's the community that needs the most medical attention. That's the community that needs the most help with the educational experience. And that's the community that's been disparately affected by policing and just bad legislation, since we landed in America, right? And so, generational problems have happened. Generational problems have been exacerbated by many things that people that wear uniforms like I did, 40, 50 years ago, perpetrated upon folks. But nowadays, that police officer has to be made aware of that, and we have to move forward somehow. And the only way we're going to do it is, shifting, reallocating resources, to policing efforts that are non-traditional. Right? That's the best way to put it. And the defunding portion, I never took defunding as abolishing, because you'll see people that are carrying signs that say defund the police, but then you'll see others that say abolish the police. The abolish the police people are being unrealistic. The defund the police understand, I think, that at least the people that say defund the police understand that it's not just a stripping of the total budget in policing, it's a stripping of the budget away that needs to, again, go into an area that can help us overall socially in communities, especially communities of color.
Either Ryan or Gayle have anything else they want to say on that topic? No.
I really appreciate Chief Fitzgerald's openness and willingness to talk about defunding and the importance that that has for a community, because there are a lot of police departments that are very resistant to even hearing the word defund, that it shuts down conversation. And so when you have a police department that, a leader, so one of the things we do know is that supervisors and leaders are the key to change. If you have supervisors who allow bad behavior, once, one joke, one off-color joke, of whatever kind, pick, that then encourages people to continue to do it. So when you have a leader who shuts stuff down immediately, it changes the culture of that police department, and which then impacts every single person in the community, because attitudes shift. So having strong leadership that isn't afraid to talk about hard issues is really a key to effective police reform that's meaningful and not just lip service.
Great. So Ryan, you mentioned how policing is just the first place to challenge systems of oppression, and Gayle and Chief Fitzgerald both discussed how important education is in preparing future officers. So I want to look at the public education system here for a moment. So what role should our public education system play, if any, in teaching about and dismantling colorblind ideologies, white privilege, and white supremacy? And how might teaching about and dismantling these systems have an impact on the criminal justice system in the U.S.?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, that's a tough one, right? You asking people to relinquish their power, right? The things that allow them to be comfortable and put them in an advantage over others, right? And who wants to do that naturally, right? And right now in the country, right, we have a battle over history, right? We have one group of people that want to acknowledge, pieces like the 1619 Project as factual American history, right? And then you still have other individuals stating that Columbus discovered America, right? And so it's, first of all, we need to start with the history aspect, right? I don't want to get political, right? But it's tough when you have someone over the Department of Ed for that's really not into public education, right? So that puts that cripples education to start with, right? If you don't have someone leading it from the top that believes in public education, right? And then it's tough, right? The education system. My daughter went to private school, and man, I mean, right off the muscle, she's we all think our children are smart, right? But my daughter recognized, right, that she was one of two black kids in the class, right? But we live in our blackness in my home, though, right? But she has friends from all races, all background, right? And she had a friend's house she would go to, and then I found out that the little girl's father, right, was, everybody's open to their own, political preference, right? But it was one that I considered pretty extreme. And it was just like, it's only so much the education system can do, right? When our kids are going back home, right? They're going back into environments where, a a child and a teenager and all of us, period, right? Our first teachers, our first educators are our families, right? Our parents, our grandparents, the people that we're around, right? So I think it starts with our education system, you know, being honest and true in the classroom, right? But it's only, I feel like without, it's a lot of weight. My mother is a teacher. My daughter's mother is a teacher, and I understand the weight and the pressure that teachers are under, right? And I think it's only so much that you can place on individuals in the classroom, right, to correct the ills of our country when we know that our biggest influences are the people that we're around all the time, right? There's a lot of things that I tell my children to do, and they might do it, they might not, but I know that they're watching what I do more than anything, right? They know that I'm involved in the community. They know that I'm speaking out about the issues and that I'm passionate about it. And those are the things that I know that they really hold on to. My son this weekend, I was like, all you do is play Fortnite. Like, you need to get out the house. And his joke was, all you do is talk about politics. And I'm like, well, you know, all I could do was laugh, right? But it's proof, right, that when we don't think they are watching, they are, right? But I think for our education system, we need to start with just being honest and teaching children, you know, the truth.
So I'll come at it from the higher ed level, but first say that, I mean, everything Ryan said is absolutely correct, right? We are socialized from the time we're little, from the time we're born. You're not born to be anything. You are socialized to be something. And something that I continuously remind my students of is that if you could imagine a record, you know, like, so some of us who are of a certain age know what a big giant record looks like and what it takes to put that together. So we could go CD for those more younger folks, right? That is a CD or a record of your entire socialization is in your head. And you cannot control the images, the thoughts, the ideas that come to your brain. You can't do it. You can't control what you do with that information. So you can choose to let the information that came from racist relatives, how you grew up, if you grew up that way, you can choose to let that continue to influence you and who you are, or you can stop it and say, I recognize that thought, I know what it is, and I can do something to change it. So in education, part of the issue we have is that students are good people. They want to be good people. They are good people, but they are terrified to talk about race. Just saying the word race in my classroom can sometimes put students on edge because they're afraid that if they say Black or Hispanic or they say Muslim, that somehow just saying those words is going to make them racist. And it's a continuous battle of having to say, it's not the words, it's what you're saying. So to think about you can't control what comes into your head. So having a thought in and of itself doesn't make you racist, classist, sexist. What you do with that information does. And until we start making people really be honest about their choices, you're choosing to be racist or classist or sexist. Once you recognize it, it's a choice. So be conscious of those thoughts in your head. So part of education is to teach people to think differently. So a lot of times higher education gets labeled as too liberal, when in reality, it's about making sure that people have a broader perspective in life because they don't get everything in their home. If you think only in terms of, well, America was not discovered until Christopher Columbus came along, you're missing a significant portion of history which said the people who were living here before he arrived were perfectly happy and content until he arrived. He only discovered it in a sense of Europe didn't know it existed, but the people who were here were perfectly fine. We don't teach that. So sometimes by the time they get to college, students have never heard the terms white privilege to know what it means. So then it becomes really a reprehensible term to them that I don't have privilege. I had to work hard, failing to recognize that when walk into a room and you're reasonably certain that you're of the dominant group in the room, that is actually a privilege. Whereas if, I think, Ryan, you mentioned this earlier, when have you ever gone, when have people gone with their friends of color to where they want to go, where there might be white people might be putting themselves in the minority, and to be comfortable with it versus to constantly, that's a reality for members of the Black, brown, and tan communities. That you can walk into a store and get all of the makeup and the foods and the hair products that you want. Like, people take for granted, but those things actually matter. It's all the little things that build up that people don't understand. So if we can teach people that it's a cumulative effect. Racism, classism, sexism is a cumulative effect. If I'm getting bumped on the shoulder every time I turn around, by the end of the day and the 100th person bumps me, I'm going to lash out. It might not really have been that significant of a thing, but throughout the entire day, it's a cumulative effect. So it's a little bit of racism, a little bit of classism, a little bit of sexism that builds up and causes reactions, and as it would anyone. But we tend to focus on, well, people should just do what they're told. Well, that ignores an entire oppressive history of policing itself, but also of our general community of oppression. So part of our job as educators is to teach more broadly about that, to teach about the problems of color blindness and what that instills in children. That it actually then, instead of celebrating differences and understanding people, we end up becoming locked into our own identity based on race and our family history and not being open to anything else. It ignores the history of people of color and what that actually means and why we're at where we're at in society right now with structural racism. I should stop and let somebody else.
Well, there's a couple things here that really hit home with me. We know that a student or a child by third grade, if they're not reading to a third grade level, will more than likely not finish high school, right? I think we can all agree that that's a horrifying statistic. With that being said, if I reflect back on, my first third grade experience in parochial school, that's the same school that was playing on the old record player, jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton. So I didn't know at that time, obviously, at a first to third grader, that we're listening to a highly racist song that, right now, you'd be burned in effigy on every corner in the United States if nuns were playing that during the time that you were, supposedly in an educational setting. I preface what I'm saying with that backdrop by saying that stuck out in my mind, even though I didn't know at the time that it was, overtly racist. For me to be a young kid in first to third grade, and to now reflect back, I do think there is a place for a race-based history to be provided for kids at a very early age. I do not think this conversation should be shied away from. I do remember learning about slavery and learning about other things, but I don't remember learning about, let's say, Juneteenth, right? So it's been a selective bit of history that was allowed to be facilitated to students, at least when I was growing up. But I did get more than some of my brethren in, let's say, Texas, because I can now compare and have conversations with folks and say, well, what did you learn as you were growing up? Well, we didn't learn about this, or we didn't learn about that. And Ryan hit on it. There's no really national standard. We have somebody that's, a privateer working in the Department of Education who I don't know is the kind of unifier that we may need to have to ensure that kids are getting the kind of holistic education that they need. And we as a community, even if you're hearing, we as educators, and if we know that kids are receiving bad information growing up. Some may be racist, some maybe makes them a little numb to their own white privilege at times. Yes, you get them in college and you're able to have these tough conversations sometimes, but the tough conversations need to start a little earlier. And, I guess that's my overall point. I feel like I benefited a great deal from being in mixed classrooms and being able to know how to interact with people. So the inverse of that can be just as helpful for kids. If you come from the inner city and you go out into the suburbs, you adapt because you want to be, you want to fit in with everybody else, but you also learn how to deal with everyone else. Well, in policing, we find it so very difficult to hire and attract people to this profession, and just by sheer demographics, right? Let's talk about the demographics in Iowa. Iowa's 90% white. So, we're going to get police officers from, dairy farms or cornfields, and perhaps they don't see people like me very often, or, other than television. And again, we have to count on the fact that the educational system prepares some for integrating into society with others. That is part of the educational experience. And I think that's a huge part of the experience, to humanize others in the eyes of everyone that grows up. Because even if you're in a household that is bigoted, you still have to go to school with people, or you still have to have experiences with people who don't look like you. And you then, as Dr. Rhineberger said, start forming your own opinions about others, and start challenging some of the notions that you maybe grew up with. So it's just super uber important, and it shows itself again in policing, because when you're hiring people that maybe don't have, if you notice, I move my hands when I speak a lot. I'm from the Northeast, so it's, who are you? That kind of thing. But the bottom line is, I would hate for that to be misinterpreted as me being aggressive. It's just how I communicate. So school has a lot to do with preparing you for that communication that you see down the road with others. Yes, you may get bad, negative reinforcement at home, but school's the opportunity for us to not only make sure you're successful down the road, but make sure that you're socially successful, and that some of the things that we now are calling white privilege are peeled away a bit, and you just know how to better interact with others. And it works both ways. Although we have a name and it's called white privilege, we, as Blacks, we have the same issues, right? We see people in a way that we don't sometimes, we're not peeling back the onion, so to speak, sometimes as well. So I don't mean that to come off as one race over another race. I do know that, everyone struggles with these things, but the struggle needs to be addressed, when you hit school.
To add to what Dr. Rhineberger was saying about, talking to her students about white privilege, and be like, nah, whatever you mean, I went through different things, right? I'm not sure if this is still the statistic, but I know UNI had over 90% of its enrollment was from Iowa, right? And unlike Iowa and Iowa State, who get a lot of out-of-state students, right? Most of UNI's enrollment is Iowa, or people from Iowa, right? So you a lot of times people are coming to the university and really being around Black people for the first time, right? And then so we a lot of times, and when we talk about Iowa, we talk about rural and assume that everybody's farmers or whatever, right? But we never really address rural poverty, right? So it is hard for someone when you're talking about privilege, and there's places that I've traveled through Iowa, and I would call my friends and my family, like, man, ain't no way I would be living here. Like they doing bad. So I to an extent, I understand that, right? There's some places, right, where we're really experiencing rural poverty, right? And it was really heightened during this pandemic, right? Where a lot of students were at home, right? Really missing those meals that they would get at school. really missing other services that would be provided for them while they were at school, right? So to have those conversations, it is tough, right? And a lot of things are about race, right? But a lot of things about classism, right? So when you're talking to some people that, know that there's other people that had it way easier than them, right? And they've been working since they've been 14 or whatever, right? But it's still, then it comes to the education piece where it's like, well, there are the white privilege and the fact that there's things that you don't worry about, right? Like when you see the police, you don't tense up and take your foot off the gas and go 3 to 5 miles under the speed limit, right? Or you don't worry about open containers, or you know what I'm saying, just different things, right, that are just you just really don't think about, right? Even in working in politics, right? I've worked with some people that really believe in equality and fighting for the rights for all people, right? But don't even recognize the privilege in saying I'm a vegan. Like, I don't eat this, I don't eat that, and like, it's a lot of privilege in saying that, right? Like, and I've had to call people out in that, right? Like, while you have good intentions, like we sometimes we invited to people's homes and to different events, right? And for you to be like, nah, I'm fine, I don't eat that because I don't eat right? It takes a lot of privilege for you to do that, right? So when we addressing white privilege, even though you may have had some challenges, or you might actually do work in the name of helping others, right? There's just different things that it's just different things that we need to start talking about, right? Even when we talking about climate change, right? That's really big for a lot of young people, right? But one thing that as much as, EPA regulations and, polluting water sources and the way that asthma affects people of color more than any other population, right? We have so much other things on our plate, right, that we can't even focus on climate change when it's really affecting us the most, right? So it's privilege in that, right? When you're able to just say, my main mission is to combat climate change, right? So with people from various backgrounds and different walks of life, right, is having that conversation with them and getting them to understand that no, it's not like we saying you need to give up anything or to say that you didn't go through anything, but it's the fact that there's some things that you don't have to worry about that a lot of other people have to.
Great, thank you all. So along the same lines of educating children, many parents are having conversations about race and policing, some of them possibly for the first time, following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and many other Black people after violent encounters with police. So what is your advice for parents on discussing race, social justice, and policing?
Who's up first?
Huh? Go ahead.
Ryan? Go ahead, Ryan.
I mean, for me, to be completely honest, when I seen, like this question, I'm like, man, I don't know what it's hard for me to tell someone talk to their kids when I'm trying to figure out the words and how to comfort my own. So that I really don't know, but to be honest and to be hopeful, right? When you see these marches across the state of Iowa, just had one in Waterloo, across the country, right? These marches are more diverse than they've ever been, right? So it's really not the youth that, and like I said, with my child, having friends at school, and I don't think our children are the issue. I think it's the adults, right? When we talk about a lot of issues up for discussion in the country, right? It's not the youth that have an issue with it, right? So it's more so I don't think the issue is, and it goes back to this stuff being learned behavior, right? I don't think the issue is our children. I think it's the adults, like, adults having conversations with their peers and actually listen without thinking about a rebuttal, and actually addressing the things that they do to uphold these oppressive institutions, whether they are silent on things or whether they are deliberately carrying out acts. So.
Chief, did you want to chime in?
I don't want to take up everybody's time. these are conversations you absolutely have to have with your kids. I have them with my children. And I would hope that white families have them with their kids. Because if you're truly a friend and you're traveling with a friend and you see that a friend is being treated differently than you are, you need to intervene. You need to say something. And, you know, we're seeing kids out here now that are not used to the amount of segregation that we grew up with. And they are saying something. It's a time for activism, and you know, we see that people are taking up the mantle for you know, just, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it, I mean, we're getting a cross section of folks from around this country that are saying enough is enough as far as the mistreatment of the Black, brown, and Hispanic community. It is something that is born of having difficult conversations with your kids. And that means that other parents have had these conversations with their kids, no matter where they've come from, because everybody's not from the inner city. And everybody out there marching is certainly not from the inner city. So these conversations are being had all over our country, and there's hope. There's hope that even my kid's not going to be stopped for no reason. There's hope that my kid's not going to be beaten and pulled out of his car. I mean, these things happen. So let's pull the veil off of safety and say these things absolutely happen. And it's not just police encounters. It's encounters in a store where you're being followed in a store. These things happen. They've happened to me. They've happened to most people that look like me. They're, you know, God forbid you go into a jewelry store. You know, sometimes people think you're going to smash the counter and run out with all the jewelry. I'm a 6'2", 240-pound Black male. You know, when I'm off duty, I look like a 6'2", 240-pound Black male from the community, right? So I would love to think that, again, you know, there's the likelihood is that I'm never going to be stopped or never going to be harassed by somebody or never going to feel uncomfortable. And most likely I don't, just because I think I deal with it differently than others. I'll laugh, you know, as opposed to, you know, become aggressive. But I don't begrudge the people that get angry because, you know, people have a different boiling point or tipping point. And, you know, this tipping point that we're seeing involves more than just the people that are subject to the discrimination. This tipping point involves the people that are tired of their friends being discriminated against. And it is a time that will propel us to change the way we do business. And, you know, is change a bad thing? It's not. We're all in this together. And it sounds sappy, but no matter how we look at it, you know, our kids are growing up and our kids are intermingling with people that don't look like them, don't walk like them, and talk like them. And if we keep resisting the fact that, you know, the races in this country are coming together and are saying enough is enough, we're not going to, you know, we're not going to discriminate against you because of your race, your sex, you know, your gender, your preference, sexual preference, whatever. Then at what point are we going to, you know, take the reins as a nation or as a group and say, these are the things that we have to legislate against in a whole? And we're hearing the voices of the people that are, you know, 15 to 30 now saying that that's what they want. And we are not the majority. We are a fast and vast growing minority amongst those folks that are coming up. So the change is going to happen, whether we like it or not. And it's best to just have the conversations now. They're tough. When I say to my kid, hey, my youngest is 15, and you're still a black Latino kid, you know, it's a discussion, you know, and it's hard to have that discussion. I say, but you're the chief of police. Well, no matter whether I'm the chief of police or not, this is the way you have to, you know, carry yourself and act. And that's not a Black conversation per se. That's a conversation for every kid and every parent to have. But moreover, I think since we've been disparately affected, it has to be one that we focus on even more. And no matter what, then you kick the ball into my court and you say, hey, Chief, what are you doing about this? And that's where we step in with the education and experience with dealing with police officers and changing the culture of the department. So not to bring it back around to policing, but again, the conversations happen because of parenting. The behaviors that stop some of that have to come from inside of the police department, have to be cultural. And, the leadership of the organization sets that direction. And my hope is that, I don't get complaints like that from people in the city of Waterloo. But as they come, we address those complaints and we ensure that people feel comfortable. And I don't want, again, to have, negative I want there to be a time when parents in our city or parents across our country don't really have to have that conversation, but I would never tell anyone not to have it right now.
So I think that one of the issues we have in society is that white families are not comfortable talking about race, so they don't. They prefer to say that everyone is treated equally or should be treated equally, which ignores the long history of systemic racism, systemic classism, even gender discrimination. It just doesn't go far enough. So some of the things that I talk about with my own children or that I encourage my students to think about is understanding that we need to be better listeners, number one. Listening doesn't mean that you agree with someone, but we need to be able to listen, to understand. Half the time, nothing good comes from starting an argument. Listen, especially if you have people in your life who are are different than you. We'll just leave it much broader. Are different than you in any way. Just listening doesn't mean that you agree. But listening to understand is something different. You can learn something. But again, as I said earlier, and we've talked about earlier, you have to be open to and willing to learn, to be reflective, to think about it. So too often, white families are trying to raise colorblind children with good intentions that that's somehow better, because then they won't be racist. The problem is if you don't talk about racism specifically and about race and about structural problems, structural inequality, systemic inequality, nothing changes. It's making real honest conversations when something comes on the news, not to ignore it. Not to say, police are bad. That's a real gross generalization of what policing is like. It's about talking about that incident or talking about building in systemic conversations. The difference is that there's two components. There's the interpersonal, which people are often focused on. A lot of books right now are very much focused on how to teach people how to have better interactions, be less racist in their interactions. That doesn't fundamentally make systemic change. It will change how people act, which is the path we need in order to make change, actual true systemic change. But if we don't talk about it in the home, about what does that mean? Why are people upset about long voting lines in parts of the country where voter suppression has clearly occurred? Why are people upset? Why does our prison system have more disproportionate minority confinement? And talking about what that means and building that conversation in and going deeper with, well, it exists because a label of a criminal record is not an objective thing. As white kids, you can ride your bikes anywhere you want to. We're upper middle class. My kids have advantages that other kids don't, and we talk about those advantages that they have. You know how you got away with that at school? That would not necessarily happen if you weren't who you are and who your parents are. We talk about those things. Most families are not, most families would rather talk about sex than race. They both matter. And you have to be able to willing to talk to your kids honestly and open about race, about poverty, and not just the blaming. It's about talking about how if you hear things like, I challenge my kids, if you hear people saying things that are racist, classist, or sexist, you know what? Use your voice. It's okay to say, we don't talk that way in my house. That's not okay. Or you can't talk that way to that person. That's not okay. Until we're willing to do that, how do we, kids don't change overnight. They need that sort of continuous discussion in their households about what these things are. They don't know what racism means. They think it's only violent acts. And a lot of racism is much more undercover than that, much more veiled. And it will continue if we don't talk about it. So, you know, in some ways, my advice to parents is have more open conversations with your kids. Kids are not fragile flowers. They need to be able to hear this stuff so they can have an intelligent conversation with their own peers and with their teachers, maybe. But also to be, well, maybe only so honest with your teachers. We still want you to graduate. but also know, if your teachers are saying something that is wholly inappropriate, racist, classist, sexist, call it out. I'll support you 150%. Unless you're the one saying it. So I don't think people are having sort of those honest conversations. I don't think people are just feel like they want to be good people, and that means teaching color blindness. And that's not the way to go. It's about talking more in depth about these things, being honest. So I would encourage people to read anti-racist material, the interpersonal stuff, but also the things that get at structural change. How can we make structural change? Because you can't have one without the other. All the interpersonal stuff is important for systemic change, but we also need to be able to get to systemic change itself sooner rather than later. And also to encourage families to take care of their Black friends, neighbors, and colleagues, Black, brown, and tan. I'll use Chief Fitzgerald's trifecta there, because that's important to take care of people. To not go, I was just telling my students the other day, if you really want to truly be an ally and not be anti-racist, and want to be anti-racist, then don't go asking your Black friends, neighbors, and roommates what materials you should read. You're asking the people who are already struggling and dealing with trauma, from Breonna Taylor, from George Floyd, from countless others. You don't go ask them to do the work for you. You can go Google anything right now and find a long, long list of all the things you could read to improve your anti-racist being. Don't go making more work for our colleagues and friends of color to do the work for you. Suck it up and do it yourself.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives. I know from looking at our attendee list, I recognize several names of people who are also parents, and I'm sure that they appreciate your advice. So for our last question set this evening, we have about 8 minutes, and I want to ask all of you, so as you protect, serve, advocate, or educate Iowans, what are the most pressing issues that our local communities face with regards to race, social justice, and policing? You know, so Ryan, perhaps what do you see as, you know, sort of the most significant requests or demands that advocates have made? Gayle, how are students grappling with the current state of race, social justice, and policing? And then Chief Fitzgerald, what steps are local law enforcement agencies taking to address these issues?
Well, the chief has done a lot of good things. I would love to see a solid citizens review board. There's some great examples, especially out in Newark. It's been battled in court for some time, but the process that they have, I really think that it's something that can be replicated and modeled, and it'll allow a lot of transparency and build a lot of trust back with the community. I think about when we address the systemic issues, right? Not only race but class as well, and I think that we need to address housing. I think that's one of the bigger things, right? And I think that we have one thing that we've seen really in during this pandemic, right, was the outbreak at Tyson's, right? And then we think about the makeup of the individuals that work at Tyson's, right? And a lot of the times those same individuals that work at Tyson's had a spouse or a partner that was also working in the nursing homes, right? So it was, what they considered essential workers, but treated as if they were expendable, right? They were doing, not only taking care of our elderly, but feeding our state and our country. I think that there's some things that we can do to this is probably more of a state thing, right? Is to put more things in place to provide security and stability for our workers. I think locally addressing housing is something that is really important. Another thing is that, different reports that come out, right? They talk about a lot of things in Waterloo, right? A lot of times, the city of Cedar Falls try to duck their head and act like they aren't a part of those same reports, right? So it's addressing a lot of those issues in Cedar Falls as well. Really interesting that the university just put out a statement about the land and the Meskwaki tribe, and I'm interested to see what comes of that, right? Okay, they said the first part of acknowledging first part of addressing the issue is acknowledging the problem, right? So for the university to take that step, I'm interested to see what is next that comes from that. So I think that I think starting with those things is a good foundation. We never want to get stretched too thin, but I think that there are some things that we need to do to address to make the Cedar Valley more inclusive for everyone.
How are my students grappling? Well, it's kind of a tough time to be a criminology major. There's a lot of vitriol in the community about the careers that they want to go into, which sometimes gets conflated with individuals who have those jobs. So a police officer is a job. People who are police officers are also individuals in a job and not in a job. And so sometimes it gets very hard for them to compartmentalize the differences. And we talk a lot about taking things personally and how that can make for a very bad experience being a police officer. If you're someone who takes things very personally, that's not going to fare well for you in the job. But part of that is these conversations where they feel like, but not all police are like that. You're absolutely right. Not all police are like that. But not all Black, brown, and tan people are violent individuals. And you cannot say that not all police are like that if you are not willing to say, yep, pretty sure that Breonna Taylor just wanted to be treated like an individual, not a Black woman, not a member of the Black community. That George Floyd would have liked to have been treated as not a Black man, stereotypically violent for a nonviolent offense. So it's hard conversations that we have to have in the classroom that, you're right. Not every police officer is bad, but then you need to also start recognizing that not all Black and brown people are violent. Be honest and assess the situation. So my students struggle a little bit. We have really great students at UNI. We have some very fantastic students. They're getting great jobs. We know that they're going to be the best police officers, probation officers, correctional officers, juvenile court officers they can be. We do our best to help them get through education to get a good job. And they are really phenomenal students. But they also have to get through an academy. And sometimes we see how that changes students. But as long as we are I support my students. They're going to be in these professions. I care about them. I want them to have jobs. I want them to be safe. But I care about all of our students who aren't in those professions. And we just need to be cognizant of the fact that stereotyping anyone is a mistake. It doesn't do any good, and it will not progress us in positive ways that are needed in order to be in a safer society for the Black community or officers doing their jobs.
From a police department standpoint, in many ways, the abundance of calls that now police officers handle has taken them away from some of the more traditional behaviors that you would see in a police officer. When I grew up, I knew what officer worked in my neighborhood. I saw them all the time. I knew what shift a different officer would work on, and we built relationships with police officers. Were police officers particularly violent, or people that did the necessary work within the community to ensure that we were safe? Sure. I lived in Philadelphia. I mean, I've seen it all. But I will tell you that we got away from the community-oriented policing perspective. Many people don't like that term, community-oriented policing. It's more of a neighborhood policing strategy that's combined with community problem solving. And what happens is, at least in what we're doing in Waterloo, is assigning officers to the same areas now consistently. Before I got here, we were assigning officers based upon where they wanted to work as opposed to where they needed to be. And that consistency will now breed officers going into those communities and being more active in the same areas, building relationships with people in those areas, and also getting to know the youth that are growing up, becoming involved, and hopefully reinvesting in the community by taking advantage of some of the things that we're going to make possible for officers who want to live back in the city of Waterloo. We got away from a lot of the good old-fashioned police work and let ourselves get inundated with the new fangled police work that we're unequipped for. And we're going back to the basics. We're having the police officers write memorandums on what they've done in the community qualitatively. And I emphasize qualitatively. I could care less how many cars a police officer stops. Unless you're stopping people that are your number one, offenders within the city of Waterloo that are causing all of the problems. I don't want to see you stopping some female, that's driving her 3 kids to work and giving her 5 tickets that she'll never be able to pay, and creating that unending cycle of poverty once again. That is disruptive to the health of the community. What is healthy in the community is, this next generation of people that are growing and living to feel like we are part of that fabric of society, as opposed to the watchdogs. We're the guardians. We're the people that ensure that there's safety, and we investigate crime. However, this divorce that we're going through now in the defunding movement will hopefully help us to re-energize ourselves in other ways. I mentioned that the report goes up the chain of command. It goes to me from every police officer that covers a ward within our city. It goes through every supervisor. So everyone's on the same page about what's going on in any particular area within this community. They know when the meetings are going to be. They will know when there are community events that an officer is going to attend and to be, or the smallest police-related offenses that are really issues that stick in the craw of that particular community. So that's what we should be doing. The time that's taken away by handling crisis intervention issues and doing things that are outside of our bailiwick, those are the things we are minimizing. So I am actually more than encouraging, I'm expecting that our supervisors cancel calls that are not police-related calls. It has to start somewhere. Will we make mistakes? Sure we will. right? Sure, a supervisor will cancel a call that they probably shouldn't have. But what we have to do is set up a learning environment where they understand why they're canceling these calls when it's like, I go back to Ryan again. It's my kid won't go to school. My kid's arguing with me. I'm calling the police. We're not there for that. Cancel that call. Okay. I mean, what we do when we show up to a call like that is create another generation of kid that thinks we are the occupying force as opposed to the people that they turn to when there's a problem. So it has to start somewhere. And I think that here in Waterloo, we're going to be a good test case for the rest of the state to look at and say, and my hope is that the rest of the state will say they're doing it right down there. And they've got an idea of what the community really wants. And they're tailoring their operations towards what not only keeps the community safe, but keeps the next generation of kid in the community or young adult in the community energized about what we do and what kind of, just service orientation that we have.
Anyone else, any closing remarks? So I want to thank Mr. Stevenson, Dr. Rhineberger, and Chief Fitzgerald for their willingness to engage in this important conversation this evening. I also want to thank all of you who attended this evening's diversity colloquium. In the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology department at UNI, we are committed to continuing these conversations to build a more inclusive and diverse society. So be on the lookout for our future diversity colloquium events and have a wonderful night.